Hello and welcome to the introduction to the Smoke Simulator. My name is Andrew Price. I'm from blenderguru.com. So what I'm going to be talking today about is the fundamentals of the Smoke Simulator and how to use it effectively. Now, this presentation is one that I gave in Amsterdam back in October 2009 last year at the Blender conference. Unfortunately, the person that filmed it didn't actually share the footage with me, so I don't actually have it. Otherwise, I just show that. The good thing is, though, that I'm going to be giving a more revised, updated version of that, complete with all the updates from, the latest blends and builds and developments and things like that. So, I'm going to be covering all the basics, how to render it, how to use effective materials, and at the end of it, if you stick around that long, I'm going to be giving a short making of the promo animation that you just saw. So, let's get into it. Alright, so let's start with the fundamentals. What's changed in the way that we're now going to be creating smoke with Blender? Now, previously, using the old system, if we wanted to make smoke, what we would do is obviously start just with an object, make it emit particles into the air. We would then give those particles a halo material, and it was up to the artist to make the illusion of smoke. Now, the problem with this method is that, well, for starters, it looks painstakingly boring. The smoke result is not realistic at all. Now, part of that reason is due to the fact that the particles do not communicate with each other. They get a set piece of instructions from the emitter, and the particles fire off on their own little tangent. And again, it's up to the artist to control them in a way that sort of gives the illusion of smoke. So it's not the most realistic results. Now, if we change to the new system, as you can see, the results look a lot better. Now, why this is because it makes use of real-world physics in Blender. So you've got heat, you've got gravity, and although it doesn't use particles, basically it's called voxel data. Now, the voxel data all communicates with each other, and that big wafts of smoke, I suppose, are going to affect everything, all the other smoke within the animation. So it's a lot more realistic, it's dynamic, and on top of that, it also uses the new volumetric rendering system, which looks amazing. So how does it work? Let's get into that. Alright, so we've got the domain object. Now, anybody that's used the Fluid Simulator in the past is going to instantly be familiar with this terminology. But the domain object is basically the boundary box for which the physics will be, the simulation will be generated in. So no smoke is going to be going outside of your domain object. Secondly, you've got the flow object. Now, the flow object is what is going to be putting smoke into your scene. So when we bake it, you get some smoke like that. Alright, now let's talk briefly about the interface. So the domain box, this is they're going to be the primary controls for your smoke simulation. So let's start with this top part here. This is the top panel. We'll just focus on this. On the right hand side, we've got the behavior. So you've got gravity and heat. Now these two are opposing forces, meaning if you turn off the heat, the smoke is going to fall because there's only going to be gravity. Now the initial velocity, that's a new feature, so you're not going to find this in the alpha build as far as I'm aware, but basically what that does is it fires the smoke out. Instead of it just appearing and then wafting up with the physics, it's going to be forced out of it like a jet almost, something, and that's using you can define the speed of it by the particle system that you give the flow. Well, we'll get into that a little bit later. And you've got this dissolve feature. Now, what this does is that enabling that and using that time slide line there. The time refers to basically the amount of frames before the smoke is going to start fading away. So if you turn that off, the smoke is just going to continue to exist. Otherwise, it's going to fade away with that. And the maximum time you can give it is 100. Which I'm hoping is going to be increased in the future, because I could not use it at all in any of the animation you saw at the beginning, because obviously it was longer than 100 frames that I needed the smoke for. But the one you're going to be really focused on is that one right there. It's called the divisions. Now this is the, I suppose, the resolution of the smoke. So the higher you make that, the more realistic the smoke is going to get. So this is just a test I've done. This is the lowest resolution you can get at. Now for this little test I've got just a sphere that's emitting the smoke, and in the background there's a little vortex just to break it up a bit so you can see the different resolutions. So that's 24, and then you've got 32, that's the default, 40, as you can see 50, 60. As you can see, the more resolution you give it, the more clearer, the more cut looking the smoke looks. So that's resolution 80. So yeah, it looks as though it's shrinking, like it's getting crushed to the side. That's because it's, as I said, it's getting more clear and cut. So one thing to note, if you're doing a lot of preview animations just to test it out, your final one, if you increase the resolution a lot, you're going to notice that the smoke behaves a lot differently than when it was a low resolution, so be mindful of that. So there's all the resolution tests for you. You can just have a look at there. Now, onto this second part, the smoke high resolution. Now, that is an optional control. You do not have to enable that, but I highly recommend you do. Now, the high resolution, what that does is it makes use of wavelets. What's a wavelet? Thank you for asking. A wavelet enables large and small scale detail to be edited separately, allowing high resolution detail to be added as a post-processing step. So basically, if you imagine the smoke as, I suppose, a mesh, and you enable a displacement modifier, that's essentially what enabling high resolution is. It's adding detail to the outside of the smoke. It's giving it that defined, detailed look. Now we could get into the calculations, the algorithms that go into creating wavelets, but simply put, wavelets are awesome. So make sure you use them. So controlling the wavelets, on the left hand side you've got the divisions, which is exactly the same as the divisions which is above it. However, those divisions are going to severely increase the baking times. Like, it almost multiplies it. When I made the animations that you saw at the beginning, I did not use more than 4 ever, because it really does strain on the system. So be mindful of that. The noise method, you've got wavelet and that's a bit shoddy. I forgot it. FFT, I think you've got the two noise methods at the moment. They both give slightly differing results. I used FFT, the other one, if that's what it's called. But you're going to want to experiment with that, or what works best. They both have slightly differing results. And the strength, obviously, it affects how much exaggerated that high resolution is going to look. And the show high resolution, checking that box, it only refers to the 3D viewport. So if you've got a slow computer and you don't want the high resolution slowing down your computer whilst you're working, just make sure that's unchecked and you won't see it in the viewport, but you will in the render. Alright, now, one thing to note, wavelets increase baking times drastically. I had to add this slide just to show you an example. So on the left hand side, you've got just low resolution enabled. Now that baked in 24 seconds. On the right hand side, we checked the show high resolution box, the high resolution box, and it baked in 6 minutes and 24 seconds. So it severely increased the baking times. That was almost 13 times. I think it's slightly improved since then. This test was done a couple of months ago, but it's still something to note that you will have to pay the price for that awesome looking effects there. I think I might have skipped a slide. No, I didn't. All right. The flow object. So we just talked about the domain. Now we're talking about the flow. Now, when I spoke at the beginning, I said that the old system used particles. Now, the new system also uses the particle system, but only to an extent. Instead of giving it wind effects and making it follow the distance of the smoke like we previously did, all you're doing is selecting it so that it gives I suppose birth, that's a bit gross, it gives birth to the smoke into the scene. So every one of those particles, when it appears in each frame, it's going to be giving little puffs of smoke. So essentially, if you're just wanting a sphere that emits smoke, like most smoke tests that you see on YouTube, you're going to be only wanting to give it a lifetime of 1. So you really don't need to spend a lot of time on the particles there. It's really quite easy for the flow object. But you know, if you're doing an explosion with lots of shrapnel or something like that, and you want it to give like a puff like that, then obviously you're going to give it a longer lifetime and control the particles that way. But every single one of those particles is going to be emitting smoke behind it. You've given it the particle, you also need to make it a smoke object. So in the modifier stack, under the smoke panel, you're going to want to check the flow object button. Again, similar to the fluid simulator if you've used that. And also select the particle system. It should be available from the drop-down menu, the name of it. So just check that. Very easy for that. Now, rendering the smoke on the other end of the spectrum, this is incredibly difficult. More difficult than it needs to be, in my opinion. I'm hoping for future releases, for the final release, it's going to be a lot easier, and this is all just going to be default when you select smoke. But for the moment, this is what you need to do. Select volume for the domain object, then turn density off. Why would you turn density off? Well, that density value refers to the cube as a whole. Now, you don't want the entire cube to be showing up as one solid smoke object, obviously. You only want the smoke data to be showing. So turn density off. And now you've got these two useful little buttons here. You've got the density scale and the scattering. Now, when I first started using the smoke simulator, I kept wondering why it was really hard to see the smoke in the renders, because I had to keep turning up the light so it was more visible, and it didn't look very good. That's because those values basically refer to how thick the smoke is. Now, setting them both as 1, that is going to be, it's very faint, very hard to see. So try increasing them to say 4. Now the density scale, that's almost, I suppose, the multiplier of the scattering value. Scattering refers to the amount of light that it lets through, the level of which the smoke before the light starts to cut away. Density is the multiplier of that. Basically, try increasing them to 4, and you're going to see a lot thicker, nicer looking smoke with a lot more depth and feel to it. Now, you're going to, once you get into material, you're going to go to the texture panel now. And now there's a new type of texture. So you know how you've got the clouds and the Musgrave that you never use and all sorts of other textures in previous versions. There's a new one. It's called voxel data. So select that. And then in the domain object field, you're going to type in the name of the object, the domain object, which is cube. And down there you've got the influence, which is, that's the most important one. You've got to make sure you click density. So what that's going to do is it's going to make the smoke data itself have density, not the rest of it. So as I explained, it's very confusing to render smoke, and I hope it is streamlined in the future. Now, shadows. Yes, smoke can render a shadow. It can cast a shadow, but it won't do it by default. Basically, the object that you want the shadow to be cast onto, you need to go to the material settings of that object, such as the ground plane, and check the receive transparent option, and then smoke will cast a shadow onto it. Okay, so now that we've learned the fundamentals of smoke, I'm now going to be giving you a short demo of how you too can create smoke at home. So the version of Blender I'm using here is build 26802, which I snagged 5 minutes ago off the Graphical website. So I've grabbed this one here. Now the thing about these new builds, which is why I should pick one up, is that it's got the Mika smoke patch. I hope I pronounced his name right. But he has developed a patch which makes smoke baking so much faster. So make sure you pick it up. It's also got new features in it, which is what I'm going to be using here. So make sure you grab one before you start. Okay, so I'm going to show you a basic scene on how to create smoke. So this default cube, I'm going to make the domain object. I'm now going to add a plane, and that is going to act as our flow object for this demonstration. So with the cube selected, I'm going to click the physics panel and then add it as a smoke object. We then have the options, and we're going to select domain. Now I'm going to enable smoke high resolution and show high resolution. Those are basically all you need there. That's we're just going to leave the rest as default. And with the flow object, first thing we need to do is add a particle system. Now, as I explained in the presentation, you really only need the lifetime as 1 for most things anyway. Okay, so with that, we then add it as a smoke object, and click flow and then particle system from the drop down list there. If you have multiple particle systems, select the one that you want smoke emitted for. Okay, now if we hit Alt A, you can see that we already have smoke. It's really that easy. It's quite simple to get smoke appearing. Now, as you can see, the smoke is slowly rising up through the domain object. Now, that's basically, so we've got the particles are making the smoke appear in the scene, and then the heat is taking effect, and it's slowly rising to the top. However, life is short, so let's increase that a bit. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the domain object, and I'm going to show you this cool new feature, initial velocity. Now, if we select that, what it's going to do is it's going to take the particle normal value, which you can change here, and it's going to force the smoke out of the object. So if we now go back to the start, and we just change the division options to refresh the baking, and we then hit Alt A, and as you can see, it's coming out a lot faster. It's being forced upwards, more like a jet, and it's giving me some more interesting results, I think. And it's also speeding it up a bit as well. So yeah, experiment with the initial velocity. It's not right for everything, obviously, but I'm going to use it for now. So there you go. We've got the smoke there. It's quite nice looking. As you can see, it shows up perfectly in the 3D viewport. And now we're going to move on to the rendering stage, the nightmare. If we go to the material settings of the domain, first thing we need to do is select volume. Okay, so that's done. Now we need to change the density to 0, like so. And then you'll see the little thing disappear there. And then we go to the texture panel and we're going to select voxel data from the list. We then, under the domain object name, type in the name of the domain object. So that, in this case, is cube. Now, if we go down here, this is the important one to click. It's influence, and we need to click density. That will make sure that the density only applies to the voxel data over here. Now, if we hit render, you can see we've got some pretty awful results. Why? Because our emitter, our flow object, is showing up in our render and it looks awful. Now the reason for that is Blender 2.5 now automatically renders all particles with a halo material. Now we obviously do not want that, so let's go ahead and change it. So click the flow object, and under the particle settings we go down to the bottom, and under the render box, what do you call it, you've got emitter and halo selected, so we don't want that, so turn off emitter. And also none. We don't want anything to show up in the render. However, we do want to see our particles in the 3D viewport. So in display, click point so you can see them in the 3D viewport. Okay, now if we hit render, it's gone. Fantastic. Okay, however, you can barely see the smoke. Now, if you remember in the presentation, I said when I first started using Blender, I couldn't figure out why it wasn't showing up in the render very well. Now, the reason for that is these values by default, density, scale, and scattering, 1, are way too low. So let's give you an example. Increase it by 5 and make scattering 4. So scattering defines the amount of light it lets through the smoke before it starts to scatter, I think. And density scale is, I suppose, the multiplier for the density. So now if we hit render, there you go. We got much nicer, denser looking smoke. One final thing that I'll show you is if we go in here, we've got almost what looks like JPEG compression. These weird artifacts showing up. Now, what you can solve that. When I was using it basically for about 3 or 4 months, I didn't know you could fix it. But basically, that is an option in the material settings. So if we actually, I'll just switch that to the buffer. So if we go to the material settings for the domain object, and we go down here to the bottom in the integration part, we've got step size. Now, the lower you make that amount, the clearer and smooth looking your smoke is going to look. So if we now set this to 0.05 instead of 0.2, and we hit render now, the artifacts are now gone. So if you compare it to the other one, By the way, render buffers are back in Blender as of a day ago, which is now we're making use of that. You can see the artifacts are disappeared. One thing to note though, which I realized in my animation that I was making, is the smoother you make the smoke, the more out of focus it will look. So be advised that. Don't make it too smooth. You might want a little bit of noise in there for some scenarios. But that is something that you can use there. So now I'm going to put it into just give it some basic lighting. I'm going to try and make it look like an outdoors scene. So I'm going to give this the material of the sun. And this is going to act as the sky lighting. Don't want it to give shadows. And now the floor object, I'm just going to give it a plane. Now I mentioned that we can do shadows with the new Smoke Simulator. I'll just show you how to do that now. Add a new material to the plane. Go down to the bottom here and under shadow click Receive Transparent. Now if we hit render, there you have it. We now have shadows. And it's really that simple. That's all that is required to create smoke in Blender 2.5. So experiment, have a bit of fun, and do something creative. Alright, now onto the making of video. Now believe it or not, the driving force behind the promo animation that you saw at the beginning was actually this very tutorial that you're watching. So I've had this tutorial in mind for quite a while now, and I wanted to create an animation that would entice people to watch the video. So I wanted to show the different levels of detail. So I wanted to show distant smoke as well as smoke that was up close to the camera. So I stupidly decided on the most complex scene that I could think of, and that was a city that had just been hit with an earthquake. I sketched out what I wanted the building to look like, and then I ran a few mock-ups in Photoshop just to get the sort of look I went for. I eventually decided on a concept of having a high detailed building in which the camera would zoom out of, the building would fall, and then you would see in the background a city that was also smoky and on fire, etc. So to start with, I needed to build the up-close building that the camera would start in. So I've got a few reference photos off the internet and basically made a building that was upstanding. And then once I built that, I started to destroy it. So I cut a few holes in the walls, made it look like very unstable, and then it was basically up to just adding debris and rubble from that stage, cords hanging from the ceiling. The debris and rubble actually was one of the most fun things to create. It was basically I just made chunks of concrete, and then using the record to IPO function, I basically dropped those chunks of concrete onto a plane and then left them there. And that was basically the easiest way to create rubble. It was brilliant. And then from there I need to create the room. So I got a bed, a table. I wanted to look, I suppose, like a teenager, like my room. A desk, so it's got a MacBook on the table there. And it needed to be all shaken apart. So everything's on the floor. There's books, there's pens, things like that. I textured it, lit it, and it was basically ready to go. Then I need to create the city. Now, believe it or not, the city was one of the easiest things to create, and that is thanks to the fact that it was camera mapped. Now, what that means is that I did not model the city, at least not very much of it anyway. Basically, what I did was I got this photo off Flickr, and I basically chopped it up in Photoshop into separate files for the building. So I isolated each building, and then created a virtual building in Blender and then stuck those files to it. That is essentially what camera mapping is. You can then move the camera in and out of the scene, and it looks basically like video footage of a helicopter flight. And it's quite useful, quite fun to do, quite easy. I might do a tutorial on it later. If people want me to do that, let me know. So that was done. So basically I had the scene ready to go, ready to render. Then I moved on to the smoke, the key component. And that was when I realized how big of a bite I'd bitten off, and because mainly I had to face the fact that Blender 2.5 was in alpha stage, so there is a lot of bugs. Once I got over that fact, I realized that basically to render all of this smoke that I wanted into one scene, I would need a supercomputer, or I would need to be super smart. So instead of buying a supercomputer, I basically cut up each smoke component. So basically I had 5 domains in total. So I had the smoke at the beginning where the up close smoke that we used high detail. That was one domain. Then as the camera zoomed out, there's the mid-ground smoke, I called it. Once the building fell, there was the 3 smokes. There was the background smoke, the middle ground smoke, and the foreground smoke. Each of those were rendered into 5 groups of PNG frame files. All of this data was then composited together in one big compositing mess, as you can see here, and basically that produced the final result. Okay, well that concludes the video. Thanks very much for watching. As always, I welcome your feedback on what you thought of it and how I can do things better in the future. I'm interested on hearing on what you think of the webcam idea, whether or not you'd prefer not to see my face in the future. So let me know in the comments what you thought of the video, and stay tuned next week because I'll be showing you how to create realistic fire in